Well, good evening, everyone. It's great to have you joining us this evening for the Financial Foundations and Old Money, New Opportunities. I'm Sheri Meister. I'm the director of the Minnesota and the Dakotas United Methodist Foundations. And tonight with me, I have Jeff Pospisil, who is our director of finance for the Dakotas, and Barb Brower will be joining us, who is the director for the finance in Minnesota. All right, thank you. So Financial Foundations, Old Money, New Opportunities. And again, we're covering all three states in both conferences with Jeff Pospisil, Barb Brower, and myself. You know, we always ground our presentations, or we try to, and Jeff and I have done these in the past, and we want to just welcome Barb and say it's just great to have her along with us, and going forward having her involved as well. But we try to ground our presentations in Scripture. And much of the work that I do, I've used Matthew 6:21, for where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. When I sat down to put this workshop together, this verse plus the two before it really spoke to me, because it talked about how our treasures, that sometimes we just hang on to them. And so starting with verse 19, do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust consume, and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust consumes, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. So where you find your love for ministry, that's where your heart should be and where your treasure is. And then I think this is so telling, that the manner in which a church balances its cash, liquidity, opportunities speaks volumes about how that church demonstrates financial stewardship. How does your church look on how you are managing the finances and the resources that are given to you as a church? Now we're going to jump ahead here because Barb's still setting it up. And so let's start ahead with Jeff. Jeff, you want to go? And then when Barb gets on here, we can kind of swing back to that one when you're finished.
Yeah. First of all, I want to talk about the right way to set up a fund, because a lot of us, we'll talk a little bit later about the issue of what if you have stuff set up, but there's right way to set up your funds, whether they're designated funds or donor restricted funds. That it's a great example. And I remember it was a number of years ago, I was meeting with Grand Forks Wesley United Methodist Church, and they just replaced their boiler. So they had this old boiler, they just replaced it with a new one, and I was visiting with them, and I asked them, so what are your plans for replacing the new boiler? And they started thinking, oh, yeah, if we start putting money aside, because this was about, I'm making up numbers, but you know, it was about $50,000 or something like that at the time. Maybe it was 30, who knows? Either way, I'm making it up, that part. It's a real story, making up the numbers. Anyway, but they started thinking about it. Instead of us having to finance something, what if we set up a fund and started putting a little bit each year towards that new boiler fund, and then all of a sudden the bank is paying us interest instead of us paying the bank interest. And they like the idea. So I just walk through it. This is what I do with most of my funds, is I try to define them and set them up right when I get a chance. So go ahead and go to the next. So the first one, establish a very clear purpose. I mean, crystal clear. So for the boiler replacement fund, purpose is to ensure the church has enough funds for a heating system when the boiler dies. So even then, we're kind of general here. We're a heating system. We don't know if boilers are going to be needed in 30 years or so, but we'll have something to replace whatever this is with the boiler. And then I also put in there that it may also be used for boiler repairs outside of regular maintenance. So those kind of when you're at the point where we had a kind of a joke when I was with Bismarck United Methodist Church, First United Methodist Church. We knew it was a bad sign when our boiler repair guy ended up becoming a member of our church. So that was us keeping on putting in more and more beyond the regular maintenance to that. Also establishing who is responsible for the fund. Here I'd put the trustees, but whatever group. And then how will those funds be invested? And, are they going to be kept in the church's checking account? Are they going to be in a savings account? Are they going to be in the foundation? Whatever that is. And go ahead and go to the next one. Yeah, making sure you're crystal clear. And then the next thing is establishing a target balance, because I got to tell you, if you don't have a target, it doesn't even matter where you're shooting. And all of a sudden, where you're shooting is just, it depends on the whims of the day. So I talking with the guy, he thought that by 2045, which is how long they thought the boiler would last, that they would need maybe as much as $100,000. And so all of a sudden, that's our target. And you just set up that very clear target. For others, it might be a percentage of your budget. So if you're going to have a rainy day fund, if you follow Dave Ramsey, that might be that 3 to 6 months. There's other things that you might end up, but it's nice to have a target or an index that you can aim at, so you know if you're getting there. Go ahead and go to the next one. And then I like to get very clear, because especially if it's a 20 or 30-year fund like this boiler one is, there's going to be times when you're going to think, should we pull money or should we not? Or when should we start making contributions? And so for me, like this boiler fund, that 100% mark, this is just a thermometer. So anything below that 100% mark, I need to be making plans and making some kind of contribution. Over that period of time, what do I need to be putting in? Do I need to be fundraising? Do I need to be putting something from the operating budget? And then there's going to be that part where you're probably in that safe zone, that white area, and that's where you really should only use it for that intended purpose. But sometimes you're going to see that your funds, sometimes especially if it's invested in the foundation, the stock market might take a big jump, and all of a sudden you have more money than you knew what to do with. And so sometimes it becomes proper then to actually have a place where I do in that green where it says the administrative council shall repurpose excess funds, and they should put it to some other good use within the church, but it's always nice to have a guide to tell you when you will make contributions, when you're safe to make withdrawals, and then also when it's actually wise to make withdrawals. And go ahead and go to the next. And then, so for me, what I like then is good reporting then to show us. So whenever you're doing any reporting on this fund, if I would have shown that I had $5,000, I did this slide back in 2016, if you couldn't tell. But anyway, I like to go ahead and say, okay, here's my plan. I got $5,000 in there. We gained $362 so far. My plan is to put $1,000 a year in there. So where is that going to put us by 2045? And right then you would see, well, we're getting close. We're at 88,097 is where we're on pace to get. So, and also you can see we're 6% of the way there, but we got a long ways to go. At that time, we had 30 years to go. So, and go ahead and go to the next. And also, what I like to do on my reports then, if I'm issuing a report on where our fund balance is, I always put that purpose right back in there, because the craziest thing is that people, there's this quote, and I forget who said it, but basically the quote is, the palest ink is much stronger than the most wonderful memory. So because we just have a hard time keeping those little facts straight. And then we have a hard time, we just have a hard time with that. And then we kind of skew it based on what we had for breakfast or what we're feeling for anxiety or whatever it is. But if we got it written down, then it really helps actually guide us. So, but that is how, if I was setting up a new fund, when I do set up a new fund, that is how I do that. All right.
Great. All right. Thanks, Jeff. And this is where we're going to talk a little bit about the reserves that Jeff just talked about, and then the endowments. And we get lots of questions on what is the difference between a reserve and an endowment. And the reserves are set up for those very things that Jeff talked about, the emergencies, the unexpected, the boilers, any of those things, the roofs. We see a lot of requests in how to take care of roofs. And so you would have a reserve for some of those areas of those things that are fixable and things that you need to have sometimes reconstructed. But an endowment is set aside and usually restricted in some way. And the biggest restriction is usually that the principal or the corpus is intact, so it can grow over time. And then you use that earnings for an annual investment income for programs or operations or purposes that's specified by the donor to the endowment. Now, not all endowments have to be set up by a donor. You can take funds that you have saved over many years and endow them for a specific purpose within the church or for a specific program or ministry. But many times endowments are started because you had someone within your church that gave a large gift to the church, and they wanted that gift to be used for the rest, for eternity. So they endow it, and then you use the earnings off of there for something that's designated within your church or your church ministry.
Sheri, I'd like to add to that, if I may. This is Barb.
Hi, Barb. Welcome. Yes.
Yeah, thank you. From an audit perspective and from a CPA perspective, you're now looking at whether your funds are donor restricted or not. And so I think the main key thing here, you can set up an endowment, the board can set up an endowment, but that would be a board designated endowment. You want to be sure that's different from a donor designated endowment, because a donor designated endowment would need approval from the donor to change the requirements of the gift. Whereas if it's board designated, your own church board designating it and setting it up, then you can change the intent at any time. So it's very important to know whether your funds, if you set them up as an endowment fund, are restricted by you, the church board, or the actual donor of the gift. Does that make sense?
It does. And the donor can also designate it for the church to set that up. If they don't have any, they can give permission for the church board to set those guidelines up.
Yes, they can. And when that happens, the church board should make it as open-ended as possible. They should work with the donor to make it open-ended, saying something like a similar cost. So, maybe if it's real broad to children's ministry, maybe you could say children and youth ministry or a similar cause, something so that it opens it up for the board to help guide the decision in the future. Because what I see so often, I have funds that are sitting on the balance sheet gaining income, earning interest, but they can't be used because the activity that they were designated for no longer exists. And I think you're probably going to get into that, Sheri.
Yep, we'll get into that in just a little bit. But yeah, thanks, Barb. Yeah, we want to make sure that those we're true to the donor when it is a donor gift that is given to set up the endowment. The goal, as Barb had mentioned, of the endowment is allow the principal to grow without withdrawals so that corpus increases over time. And then the interest earned from the account then isn't available every year and should be used to enhance ministry. So let's take an example of the first one. The principal or corpus of the money allocated to the account is generally not used to fund an annual operating expense. Now that's not always the case because a donor can give it to the annual operating expense, but typically an endowed gift goes to ministries or to enhancing the ministries of the church. So Mrs. Smith gives Best Church UMC a gift of $100,000 to be used for missions. How much money of that should the church expect to use per year? And most commonly, people use between 4 and 5%. So each year, $4,500 could be used for missions. Now, to make the most out of Mrs. Smith's gift, again, it's 4 to 5%. And what program can this be used for? And these are the things that the committee needs to talk about. Missions. Now you have to define missions, and it's best if Mrs. Smith or Mrs. and Mr. Smith are still living, because then they can define what they wanted their gift to go to. But missions can be defined in many different ways, and is it meet the needs of your church. You should never use a gift and spend a gift just to spend it if it's not in alignment with what the goals, missions, and values of your church is. So you don't want to get into pet projects. Some of you that have heard our presentations before know that there was a gift given to a church one time that the donor wanted another pulpit. Well, the church didn't need any more pulpits, so they had to work with the donor to define how that gift would help the mission and the programs and the ministries of that church. Now, do you have to hand this over to the missions committee? Your committee should all be working together, and they should be all aligned so that you know where those dollars are going. And
Sheri, I got a question.
Okay.
Oh, this is Jeff. So let's just say, for example, that, Mrs. Smith gave this 30 years ago, and now you've had a missions committee chair that has run the show on this money for 30 years, but they're not in line with the church. What do you do?
Well, that's where you have to define missions. Sometimes we see that the church mission program is to go to the same mission every year, and that it will only go to a specific mission that church has supported forever. But missions can be defined in so many different ways. I mean, missions can be a church front yard program that they're going out into their community. And that's where it's really important that they define the word missions. And so that this is where it gets kind of tricky, because if Mrs. Smith just said missions, then it can be the missions of that church. It doesn't have to be one specific mission. Did that answer your question?
The chairperson's really persistent and doesn't want to give up control.
Yeah, I know. We see
or redefine it.
Well, that's
I'm just
where,
saying hypothetically, not that this has ever happened to us today.
Exactly. Jeff's alluding to a situation where we went to visit a church, and they had a large sum of money. It was larger than this, $100,000. And before we could even give our presentation, they made it very clear that Mrs. Smith wanted it to stay right there and do what it was doing, which was nothing. just as it had been.
Because so-and-so used to be a friend of the family of Mrs. Smith, and that's why they could speak for Mrs. Smith, who has been dead for 20 years.
Right. And since then, they've worked in their church to align their vision and their mission, and they have done lots of communication, lots of education. And we had Diane Weller, they asked Diane Weller from our office to go back to that church, and now they have identified the ways that those dollars can be spent, and went back, read the documentation, did everything they needed to do, and follow the guidelines to find out that the committee was speaking for what this committee person wanted it to be for, not actually what the gift was intended for. And so they are now using those dollars to enhance the ministry of their church. So that, and I just already talked about this, but it's to make the most of Mrs. Smith's gift. You want the missions committee in line with the goals of the church. And too often, when we sound like we're kind of hard and cold on this, but we've seen it many times, too often pet projects and people that have a pretty determined idea what some of these monies should be used for have set their rules without it being in the wishes of the donor. So the best is to go back to the original documentation and then to work with the family. And Barb's right. If it is, if the language says you have to buy a piano every year or a new pulpit every year with those gifts, it would, and there's no family members left, and the donor has been gone for a number of years, it would take legal action to change that. But if members are still there, family members are still alive, you can work with them to work with the family and the account to get in line with the goals of the church. You never want to just be spending the money to spend the money, because that is not in the best interest of your church. And then and I'll talk about this in a little deeper here in a minute, but all gifts, every committee should know about them, and your leadership team and administrative board should be aware of those gifts. And we have had different church situations. I was pretty close to one that the leadership team and the administrative boards were not aware of some of the monies that were available in the children's area or in the UMW or in the I just lost what it is, but it'll come back to me here in a second. But the Memorial Committee had monies that were just sitting there, and they weren't sharing those with the rest of the committees, and so everybody should be aware of those. And we get stuck in our definitions and our beliefs of how it should be and miss the opportunity of how it could be. And I spoke to this earlier, but the endowment is to allow the principal to grow without withdrawals, so the underlying corpus increases over time, and that is the goal. But in uncertain times, it becomes tempting to just use a little bit of that corpus. Just this one time. Can we use it? Can we borrow from it? Those are no's. You cannot. Mrs. Smith wanted her money used for a specific thing. But have you defined missions? Are you working in the mission field? Missions can be defined in so many different ways. Music ministries and things can be defined in so many ways. If the money's supposed to go to music, it doesn't have to be just for the piano, and it doesn't have to be just for sheet music. How can those dollars be used to enhance the ministry of the intent of the donor?
We got some good questions from Randy Coppin about what happens if the family's gone and you're stuck at buying a pulpit every year or a piano every year. What is your recourse for that? Bill Lint, retired pastor, used to tell about this Presbyterian church that used to be forced to buy a rose stained glass window every next 10 number of years or something like that. And beautiful windows, but does a church really need 20 rose stained glass windows? So what happens if you're stuck with something like this?
Randy, you really have to take it. If there's absolutely no family available to change that. We had a church that the family gave to the radio fund. Well, we were fortunate because the family's still living. The donor has been gone for years, but the family's still living, so we were able to change that language. But had that not happened, those dollars would have had to go to the radio fund rather than the media fund, because we changed it so that it would be more of a long-term,
Can you
what?
Can you bring this to the? I remember reading that you can bring some of these things to the Attorney General.
Right. You have to take it to the Attorney General or to a lawyer to have that changed if the family is no longer involved. It has to have legal action. And depending on the process, it can be kind of a lengthy process. But again, you don't need a pulpit every year. So you it's probably worth it, especially if it's a substantial amount. You don't want to just leave the dollars sitting there. That's not a benefit to the church, and it was really not the intent of the donor. It was unfortunate that the donor and the church leadership weren't working together to keep that in line of what the mission and the goals are and the vision. But people that aren't familiar with working with the gifts and that type of thing, they get really excited when a gift comes, so they accept it as it is in the language. But it's perfectly okay to visit with the donor and visit with any of the family members so that those dollars and those gifts align with the church. I've seriously had a church say that they will not accept another piano because they've had so many pianos donated to them. And they said it was very difficult at the beginning to say, no, we're not going to take your piano.
Can I tell another Grand Forks Wesley story?
Sure.
We had a donor from Grand Forks Wesley who wanted to set up a building fund, but in case the church ever closed, they didn't want it to go to anything exotic. And so we really had to get down to it to where we just ran through the scenarios. Okay, what do you mean by exotic? Well, I mean, I wanted to go to Grand Forks Zion. Okay, well, let's just write Grand Forks Zion. And then I said, what if Zion closes? Well, then I wanted to go to the Builders Club, and we just had to work through that. But that's easy to catch in the front end if you have those conversations, but not easy if it's already done and the family's going on. I do wonder who's going to enforce it if you as a church body decided to change that.
Well, Jeff, the one person that doesn't want the ministry that the church body decided they were going to go for could challenge it. So
would bring it to the Attorney General too,
right,
as same person. Yep. So.
Right. So you would have to. I would just advise that you do that first. We haven't seen that many times that people have had to do that. But that is the best choice, is to go right to the Attorney General or to an attorney. Maybe there would be an attorney that would do it pro bono that's within your congregation. So this is what we see too many times, is that the monies are in silos. Right now, it doesn't seem to matter which area I work in. People have been talking about the silos. People have been working in silos. And missions will keep their money, and music will keep their money, trustees will keep their money, and the UMW. And this is just, I just put these out there. This could be any one of the committees of your churches. But just think of the possibilities where if all of those monies were pooled, how you could have better managed the dollars and used it for ministry. We have a couple churches that we know of that each have one one church has two separate $1 million accounts. And because of the language and the stipulation on the one, they will not work with the other $1 million account. And so there's two separate ones and two separate rules and regulations and language for each one of them, and the committees won't work together. We have that in two separate churches. The other one is like $500 and $750. And if all of those barriers could be broken down so that those dollars could work together for the mission and the ministries of the church, it would be just such a healthier place. And so we are slowly helping them break some of those down and seeing the opportunities on the other side of it. But for years, those dollars have sat there, and people will only give to one area and not the other area, and it's just like polar opposites, and it's just a force of tension within these two churches. And then you just want to make sure that the monies are used to enhance the ministries of your church. And as we talked before, and Barb was exactly right, and Jeff is too, about challenging it if you have the attorney available, but you want to be true to that donor. And you should not be, as a committee, interpreting the wishes of the donor to meet the needs of your pet projects within the church. And that's what we saw, Jeff and I saw at one of the very first churches the two of us went out together that he was talked about earlier. That they were protecting those dollars for a pet project that one of the committee members wanted done in the church. So to make sure that some of these things are avoided, you want to make sure your documentation on each endowment fund is up to date. You want to make sure that they are, it's read and that you're being true to the endowment, but that you're using those dollars. We have too many that don't have stipulations on the dollars, and they're not using, the church committees aren't using the dollars because they're afraid that they're going to run out of money. And they have a scarcity, a sparsity mentality, and they're running out of fear and working out of fear. And you want to make sure that that documentation is there so you can use those dollars for ministries. That's why the funds were given. And as the ministry changes, is the intent of the endowment for current needs, or is it dated? Like the radio fund. Radio funds right now would be obsolete because we're moving into online, and some are doing TV and other ways of media, but radio would probably be obsolete. And then do you need to revisit the intent and work with the donor if one of the family members are still living, and then provide that language to make it current? And you want to do this with your donors now too. When we have a donor and we're working with a donor, in fact, I'm working with a donor right now that'll end up being over $1 million gift. And we want to make sure, and it's just a delight to work with this family because they understand that they want it to be for current ministries, but they also want it to be for the long term. So how can we make that language with this donor, make sure that the money is being able to be used for years and years and years to come? And then you always want the funds to be aligned with the mission of your church.
Sheri, can I add just a little bit?
Sure. Mm-hmm.
Some people might be asking, why go through all this? And I think it encourages generosity among your members if they know they can trust you. If they know that they can give a gift, you will honor their legacy and kind of follow through with them. And they want to benefit the church. The reason they're giving isn't because they want to control the church, most likely. It's most likely because they love the church and they want to see the church do well. And so that's why when you see churches, I've seen churches that managed it poorly, and guess what? They get very few large gifts. I mean, that's the way it is. And then you see other churches where they try to do it appropriately. the church you were with, Sioux Falls First, or you're still with them, but you ironed out their endowments and their foundation and got everything, all the records clear, and then it became clear, and then that opened it up for more giving, because people could trust that the money that they're going to give is going to be cared for properly, going to be spent properly, and it just gives you confidence in the whole leadership. So.
Correct. And then the other thing that we haven't talked about that we need, or that should always happen, is that celebrate the gifts. If the donor wants to be anonymous, celebrate it in an anonymous way, but celebrate that people are investing in your church, and celebrate it by telling the stories of the ministry that happened because of the gift. It's one thing to say thank you for this $100,000 gift or this $50,000 gift, and that's all wonderful, but the funds will grow once you start to celebrate the ministry that came about or that was enhanced because of that gift. So things to look at are, do you have a gift acceptance policy, and do you have a spending policy? So if you have a gift acceptance policy, and we can give you examples of these too, then you can write in there that you will not accept any more pianos, or that your gift has to be in line, and the intent of the gift, it needs to be in line with the mission of the church. And then the spending policy helps so that you don't spend down the corpus or the principle of the gift, and that you have a percentage based on the earnings that you spend each year. And if you do it on a trailing average and keep it at 4 to 5%, then you still have dollars when the markets are low, as they are right now, a little bit lower, or if the markets are real high, it doesn't give you, you're not tempted to spend at the whole 20% like we saw at the end of 2019. So it keeps you balanced in that area.
Yeah. Do you mind if I do a quick plug for the foundation?
No, go ahead. Would you?
Because one of the things I think I value the most, I've been a conference treasurer now for 12 plus years. And what I notice is that a lot of times a church will set up money and they'll either forget about it, or they'll forget what the purpose is, and that kind of thing. What I've valued most about the foundation is that every year you get a letter saying, here is the purpose, here is the family, unless it's anonymous, but here's the family, here's the legacy behind it, and here's how much you can spend it, and here's how you should spend it. Roughly, or if it's missions or capital projects. But I love the memory of the foundation and help and care for the gifts. So, and a church foundation should be set up like that. And if a church foundation isn't, that's the time you'd reach your conference's foundation. But there should always be that repetition of, here's who we're, like we said, celebrating, here's who we're remembering, here's the purpose of the gift, and here's how much we should use.
That's exactly right, Jeff. I'm going to stop sharing this now because we're finished with the PowerPoint. You are exactly right, and that is the one thing that we'll do at the foundation, is make sure that we stay true to that language and help churches stay true to that language. We've had finance committees that have turned over, or investment committees that have turned over, call us to see if they can use money from an endowment a certain way. And we have the language on file, so we're able to keep it true to the donor, and we can be the bad cop as they're trying to be the good cop and doing something good. We can be the bad cop to say, that really doesn't fit in the line of what the donor wanted, or here's some ideas of how these dollars would best benefit your church in line with the way the donor would like it spent. Barb, would you have anything else to add? Not sure what happened to Barb, but anyway, we want to say.
Well, I wasn't sure if I could unmute my mic or whether Doreen was handling that, but no, I think it's a very good idea to create a 4 or 5% spending policy. When I was controller at Minnesota Public Radio, we had a very large endowment related to the American Public Media Group, and that's what we did. We spent about 5% annually, and in really good years, then you build up your corpus, and then in really lean years, you still have some money to use for your mission and programming.
Right. Wonderful. Well, we want to say thank you to everyone who joined us tonight, and know that we are here to help you. We are here to provide resources if you need them. We're here to answer some of your questions. And then we're also here to meet with your finance or your investment committees or your leadership teams if we can be of benefit in those areas. So